Okay, if you're ready, I think now's as good a time as any to start because we've got people who are participating online as well, and so we don't want to keep them waiting. Thank you all for joining this event. We're talking about disrupting Europe, truth and social media, and can you find any of it on social media? My name's Ryan Heath. I'm author of the Morning Playbook column that hopefully many of you read from time to time. And with us is a really excellent panel today to talk about this strange, difficult new world that we all find ourselves in. But I think that the most appropriate thing is to immediately hand over to our host, the EU Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly, who has some brief introductory remarks before we get into the panel.
Thank you, Ryan. Good morning, everybody. And I'd like to begin by extending a very warm welcome to all of you and to thank you for taking the time out of your busy lives to come to this seminar. I'd like particularly to thank our distinguished panel and to thank Ryan Heath of Politico for agreeing to moderate our conversation here today. The idea for this topic, unsurprisingly, was partly cued by the UK referendum result and the sense of shock that then spread throughout the EU and the EU institutions. For the first time, a member state has decided to leave, and this obviously magnified other EU challenges, from the economy to refugees, migration, and rising Euroscepticism. A perfect storm was developing, and Brexit was the eye. I don't have to tell this audience about the catastrophizing that followed the UK vote, and time does not allow me to lay out the multiple possible scenarios that continue to be predicted for this union. No one can say with any certainty how the EU will look and feel in 2 years' time, or 5 years, or 20 years. As multiple separate and overlapping layers of politics are being played out, both here in this city and in every member state and regional capital, we cannot possibly know how the cards will fall. But the drama of Brexit does allow us to examine the forces that help to shape the result and continue to shape the current narrative of a challenged and contested European Union. In the last 4 months, we've had a myriad perspectives on that narrative, informed by ideas from the worlds of politics, geopolitics, economics, human rights, sociology, and for the purposes of our discussion here today, media and social media. What we know about the EU in its institutional sense and how we feel about the EU is pretty much entirely shaped by what we take in through our chosen media every day. And I say chosen because increasingly each of us can create our own bespoke media world. We can quite easily choose to adapt our media diet to one where we have limited exposure to views contrary to our own, and where our own attitudes and prejudices are amplified through algorithms engineered through our smartphone clicking choices. I sometimes find myself being stalked online by a dress or a hotel somewhere that I idly clicked on months ago. But as it is with consumer products, it can also be with our entire worldview. It is noted, packaged, amplified, and then served up very personally to us every day on our laptops or smartphone screens. Few people in the Union are ever likely to watch a European Parliament debate or a Commission press conference, let alone follow the labyrinthine passage of legislation from start to finish. Few people in the EU care what goes on in Brussels unless they are told by their media what has happened and whether it is good or bad for them. Boris Johnson, now the UK Foreign Secretary, reportedly spent his time as a journalist in this city, arriving into press conferences and asking two simple questions. What's this about, and why is it bad for Britain? This is the same Boris Johnson whose previously unpublished, impassioned newspaper column calling on voters not to leave the EU has just appeared in a new book. Boris had apparently written 2 columns, and we all now know how that particular roll of the dice ended. While Johnson did seem genuinely to be struggling with the issue, his unpublished column nonetheless stated, "Britain is a great nation, a global force for good. It is surely a boon for the world and for Europe that she should be intimately engaged in the EU. This is a market on our doorstep, ready for further exploitation by British firms. The membership fee seems rather small for all that access." Professor Cathcart will be able better to explore the UK media coverage of the EU, but I suspect that had even the most pro-EU of us spent the 6 months prior to Brexit reading nothing but the Daily Mail, a UK mass-market tabloid with a highly political and anti-EU agenda, many of us might also have voted to leave. And while we can demonise it and other populist media across the EU because of the dystopian image of the Union that it portrays, it has to be recognised that they can be brilliantly executed media products, weaving headlines, stories and images together to produce an at times hypnotic effect on their readers. The challenge for the EU institutions and for those member state governments and political parties who wish to stop the growth of Euroscepticism is how to engage with that narrative, not just through their own communication channels, but also through the way in which they deal with the citizen concerns that such media accurately intuit and frequently exploit. In a leaked email about a private event speech that she gave some time ago, Hillary Clinton reportedly talks about the perception among many people, including the middle class, that the game is rigged by big corporations and an enabling political class. What she also says, which is unusually quoted, is that greater transparency is needed to deal with this. But the latter challenge isn't necessarily one for today. What I hope we will have from multiple areas of engagement is an exploration of how the EU image is shaped for good or for bad, and what we can learn from the mediation of Brexit, of the refugee crisis, and of other issues that are shaping the story of the EU in 2016 and beyond. It would also be interesting to address the information deficit that comes not from the media, but from member state governments themselves, who come to Brussels to make largely behind closed doors decisions on issues vital to all of our lives, but who may subsequently fail adequately to account for their own role in that decision-making. While preparing for today, I asked some of my office's young stagiaires, selected from all across the EU, briefly to describe how the EU comes across in their member state, and particularly for its young people. And these are some of the responses. From Belgium. Even in Belgium, where the EU is almost in people's backyard, it cannot be said that the EU is mediated from a truly European perspective. From Cyprus. Although some people have lost faith in the reunification of the island, the EU is perhaps the only common interest that merges both sides. It seems like a security, peace and hope between the two communities. From Finland. The Finns do not spend a lot of time thinking about the EU. After years of appeasement politics and fear of Soviet aggression, the EU has historically been seen as a protection against Russia. But benefits like free movement aren't always attributed to membership. They're just taken as normal, as part of the status quo. Our Finnish colleague also said, the True Finns party is the most visible narrative on the EU, and the chairman has described the EU system as undemocratic and run by fat cats in Brussels. The youth wing of the party started a citizens' initiative on a fix-it referendum after Brexit. From Germany, even in times of crisis, there is a European spirit in Germany, but it is not mediated enthusiastically. That would seem absurd in current times. From Italy, I didn't know that I should have thanked the EU and not the university in Wales for my Erasmus year, but this is changing for a new generation. Last Christmas, I was impressed when my 14-year-old niece listed all the EU institutions, their competences and functioning, including the EU Ombudsman. She will go far, that girl. I was relieved to know that schools stick to their great responsibility in teaching new generations our common values and our common functioning as a non-conventional international organisation. From Poland, I was 11 when my parents went to vote in the referendum on joining the EU in 2003. They knew that for my generation, it would open the possibility of living in another country and having a better economy. The only problem now is that more and more young people do not remember what Poland was like under communism. They just remember this period of prosperity and they don't care where it came from. From Slovenia, the refugee crisis gets a lot of attention, but Angela Merkel is seen as responsible for it and not the EU. In general, there is a lot of apathy about the EU, and only 24% of the electorate voted in the European Parliament elections in 2014. I think that's because a lot of Slovenians feel insignificant in the EU, that their votes and voices don't matter. The offices of the Parliament and the Commission are trying to raise awareness, but they have very few Facebook followers. And finally, from Spain, Europeanism has been part of the Spanish identity until the economic crisis started. The EU is now often reflected negatively in the media, and it becomes easy for politicians to blame Brussels. But most young people have a positive view of the EU and think it should be focused on growth and job creation. So that's just a snapshot, and most of us will find echoes of what my young colleagues have described in our own member states. What comes across very clearly to me is the power of member state media to influence perceptions and the struggle that EU institution representatives in those member states have to have their voices heard. It would be interesting to hear whether those representatives find sufficient support in mediating EU decisions from the member state governments who have negotiated and voted for them. What also comes across, and this tends to be reflected also in Poland, or in polling rather, is that younger people generally are more pro-EU than an older generation. But perhaps rightly and obviously so, they do take the benefits of EU membership for granted. Few of us who drive cars worry about the internal workings of an engine. All we care about is whether it goes or not. So over now to Ryan and the panel to take up these and other themes, and I very much look forward to hearing your own views and contributions over the next few hours. Thank you.
Well, I did have written here, welcome to the fiery part of this morning, but I think that you stole that from us. We're off to a fiery start already. Just a couple of quick housekeeping points so that we maximize involvement from everybody. There is free Wi-Fi, so don't feel that if your mobile network is on a low number of bars that you're excluded. You can just click through and agree to the terms of the Residence Palace network. If you want to contribute to the social media discussion, the hashtag is behind me right here, Disrupting EU. And I will just maybe leave you with a couple of the questions in my mind before introducing our panelists, and also to assure you that I know there are a lot of people who are doing social media for their professional lives who are here in the audience, so we're not going to act as though we have all of the answers. We're going to really include you all the way through the process as well. So, I mean, a couple of kickstart thoughts for the discussion. Whether it's the EU institutions, whether it's as journalists, whether it's people who are just making their voice known through social media, I think that we all share a responsibility to disseminate the truth. But that's not possibly the hard thing to agree on. It's if we can't agree on what the truth is, where does that leave us? And I think there are also really serious questions that maybe Isabel will be able to address when you have an EU that is dependent on complicated processes. Where does that leave you in this new environment that is so driven by emotion rather than explaining things like a complicated process? And one thing that's really, that I am struggling with is to answer at what point does an individual or an organization become an enabler of falsehood rather than someone that is just explaining something that happened. Because at some point you do become an enabler of falsehood, and I'm just not sure where that line is. But to help us explore this fascinating moment in our history, where, let's not forget, we have access to more information, we have access to more power, we have access, many of us, we have access to more money, even if it's not a great economic period. We are not doing overall bad as a continent compared to the hundreds of years that went before us. So we've got all of these things, but we don't necessarily have the same trust in each other or institutions that enable shared progress. So to help us explore all of that, I have on my right Isabel Yeguzu, who is the head of the Commission's representation in Paris, which of course is its head office in France. Professor Brian Cathcart, who comes to us from Kingston University, from a long career in journalism, and as one of the founders of the organization Hacked Off. On my left, of course, you know the Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly. Then we have Ralph Dieter Kroes, who is the longtime correspondent from ARD, the German television channel, but has a well-deserved retirement can we call you retired? Or okay. Living on in our minds. And then finally on the end, Anthony Gooch, who is a former Commission official and now running communications at the OECD. But perhaps if I turn to you, Isabel. Oh, and of course, we've got a very strict rule. I've been told no speeches, so we're going to keep this really dynamic. But to get it started, you're dealing every day with the rise of the Front National. What do you, as a civil servant, do to respond to essentially an organization that exists to eliminate you? How do you cope with the challenges that throws at you?
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this very interesting conference. It's true that in France, we've sometimes, after Brexit, we had a bit of feeling to be next in line, and I hope it's not the case. But it's true that the situation in France is not easy. It's very different from the UK situation, because, well, first of all, in France, we do not have such press as The Sun or the Daily Mail, so it's a bit different. The press is a bit more serious. And the Euroscepticism exists, is growing, but differently from UK, well, France was a founding member state. The EU is still a bit the baby of France. And there is not this difficult situation where UK was always both in and out. And in France, the situation is difficult. So it's not exactly comparable with UK. But however, the landscape is difficult because there is a growing pessimism in France, which is really incredible. Last week we had a presentation from the France Stratégie. They made a very interesting analysis on the situation in France, and every people, well, the majority of people look at the situation in France much worse than it really is. So the perception of what the real situation is much worse than what is the real situation, whatever the type of question you ask. For example, if you ask of wages, the great majority of people consider that their wages is really at the bottom, where it's usually in the average. If you ask people what is their perception of the current situation, they say it's bad. They say it's going to be worse. And they always, 80% of them consider that the situation of their children will be worse than what it is. So the pessimism of this country is really incredible and is not proportional to what the real situation is. So this is these are the building blocks on which the Front National is now building its strategy. As I said, Front National is not so present in the traditional media, but extremely efficient in the social media. I had an experience 2 weeks ago. There was a conference in Marseille by our representation in Marseille, where on migration. And this conference was interrupted by Front National, where people stand up, almost fight physically, and it was extremely difficult for the conference to take place. So it was really stopping the debate. And after that, I made a quite pushing tweet on Twitter, not insulting, but strong. And in just 1 hour, I got 50 answers from Front National. So they are extremely organized, really looking at what's happening on the social media, on the network, and really pushing and very, very well organized. And compared to that, it's true that the pro-EU do not have the same level of organization. Mrs. Le Pen has 1.5 billion followers on Twitter. Facebook account is also extremely high. So we have to organize ourselves in order to be able to respond, to be visible, and to tell the truth.
And do you, just one follow-up there, do you limit yourself to fact-checking? Is that sort of the constraint that you're in as a civil servant, or have you made a conscious decision now that you have to go further than just pointing out facts in response to those interventions?
We are preparing strong fact checking, but we want to communicate in two directions. Fact checking is one, and the second one is also promotion of what the EU does right. So not only defensive, but also proactive, and explaining what the EU is doing with good stories that we can tell and we can explain. We don't want the EU to be only on the defensive side, because we will always lose if we are only defensive. So we also want to promote all the practical and daily life input that the EU has given, and it's many very little example. We try to communicate really on the lower ground. For example, we have just had an agreement with the Association of Mayors in France. We have prepared very short information articles which they can insert in their town newspaper, because this type of press is very much read. The problem is that, exactly as you rightly pointed out, people can choose what they read, and then they get pursued at what they think is right, because they always hear and read the same things. So we have to try to find a way to contact people in a way that they would really read and it comes to them. So this is the idea behind using town newspaper, which everybody has it's in table in the morning while they're having breakfast, and to give information that way, but really to spread information in a very, very low and basic way, just to get more information.
Well, that might be a moment
that is one of the, but we can follow them.
Yep. Wolf-Dieter, you're someone who is known for being very good at turning a complicated piece of information and explaining it in simple terms. And if I can make a generalization, I would say the German media culture is certainly a very serious one. As someone who's sort of witnessed the EU's attempts to communicate itself over such a long period of time, do you have a reaction to those points from Isabel, or would you make another critique of how the EU puts itself in the world?
Maybe I would like to make another critique. My experience actually is that I don't think the institutions really want to inform. I wouldn't talk about, do not want to talk about communication too much. My business is information. And I had the pleasure to be with Boris Johnson here, correspondent in the 90s, and he was a very funny guy, but not so very much interested in facts. Maybe he was more modern than I was, because since a couple of months, we all know the term post-factual. And this is a real problem for journalists, because we are factual. Our work is based on facts, and actually I'm quite confident that factualism will regain the field which it lost, as we can see in the United States and in many European countries. But I think, look, practical things. The spokesman's service of the Commission is much too small to answer to the questions of journalists. And here in Brussels are hundreds of journalists who are interested in European topics. So this is, as we say in German, half of the rent. When someone already has interest, very often for communication, it is difficult to awaken interest. These journalists are interested in topics. And as ARD correspondent, I always felt that we are treated well here. Maybe there's an unofficial rating of media. We all felt to be a triple-A medium here. But it occurred very often that, let's say at 10:30, I sent an SMS to one of the spokespeople and got an answer 10:30 in the morning, and got an answer in the evening 9:30. Do you still need me? And this is a little problem when you broadcast news every hour, as we do over the day. And when you criticize that, and they say we don't have the money. At the same time, the Commission spends millions of euros for propaganda. They fund a TV channel, Euronews, actually contradictory to their own competition rules, and which nobody watches. In Germany, the audience of Euronews is not measurable. It's 0.01%. So this is actually not serious to measure it in that sense. So, and this is one of the areas of institution. Communication is not when you broadcast or when you write something or publish something. You need someone to receive that and who watches that or who listens. Then it is communication. And they print brochures, folders, sometimes books, which school classes run away from the information points with loaded by brochures, and they end up in a tray in the Parc Cinquantenaire or anywhere. So there would be money to do that. And this is one point where I say, actually, they know it since decennia, and they do not change it. So I guess they do not want to inform. Another point.
So it's a problem then that predates social media.
Yeah, and another proof for that. Look to the referendum campaigns we had in Europe on European topics. The referenda in France and in the Netherlands on the Constitution, and lately the referendum in Britain. They didn't argue. Because, Brussels is a big assembly of cowards. They were afraid that they would be, one could then blame for the result of the referendum. But there is also the question what is right and what is wrong. And in the referendum campaign in Britain, we have had so many lies, so many untrue arguments that actually, I would expect from an institution that they would, also from a national government, that they would defend the truth. If you do not stand for what you are doing, why should other people follow you? So it was always duck and cover when somebody criticized European policy, which you can criticize very often, but sometimes that was an unjust criticism, and we see now that a Brexit is not that easy as the promoters of Brexit told the people, and I would have expected that let's say Juncker or other ones, that they would have said, no, it is not that way. You can't have access to a single market when you don't allow free movement of workers. And it would be an important point. Instead of that, they remained silent. And even after all these referenda had the same bad result, they didn't change anything. So why don't they? My conclusion is they do not want. And I felt comfortable with that because usually we didn't need the spokesman service, but sometimes you need something official, and there you can't quote your confidential sources. You need somebody else who's speaking on behalf of the Commission, and there you need answers. And these are only 2 points: the cowardism in the political field and the practical things where My idea is they simply duck and cover and let the things run, and then they ask us, the journalists, to defend what they have to defend. It's not our job to defend the EU in no way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to turn to Brian now, given the UK example and how relevant that is there. But that is certainly one thing that I've observed in my time at Politico, is that one of the things that people find frustrating sometimes about Politico inside the Brussels bubble is they feel that it's our job somehow to defend the EU rather than to treat the EU as a fact. And so our position is certainly that you have to take the EU very, very seriously, and wouldn't be here in the size that we are if we weren't doing that. But some people do certainly feel like it's the journalist's job to defend the EU rather than to just show what is happening in the EU. But Brian, let's imagine that the Commission or others who were involved in EU debates had done it differently and had sent different information to UK journalists and had a different vision about themselves. Would that have made a difference, or is there something more structurally wrong in how UK media are treating facts or treating the EU?
Well, certainly in the short term, it would have made no difference whatsoever. A couple of weeks ago, I attended an event in London talking about the referendum, where Lucy Thomas, who was one of the leading people on the media side for the Remain campaign, said that she basically was answering the charge that they had run a negative campaign, and she said that's not true at all. We ran a very, very positive campaign, but nobody wanted to hear. And she said that there came a point quite early in the actual campaign, 3 or 4 weeks before the vote, when she received a call from the Daily Mail saying, "Why don't you stop sending us this stuff? We're never going to print any of this." You could have a brilliant commission campaign. You could design something out of this world, but you're not going to get past the news desk of the Daily Mail. So in the short term, I don't think. I mean, I've been a journalist a long time. I look back now, and I think I should have done more 20 years ago about answering the nonsense that Boris Johnson was generating from. I mean, it was a joke. It was taken lightly. At least, in kind of my circles, and we shouldn't have done that. We should have been more aggressive about it. But I think, you do have to recognise. I mean, I don't have to tell you that Britain is a unique case, but the culture and the shape of the newspaper industry in Britain is remarkable. It's not really recognised that it's changed a good deal in terms of balance because of the very sharp decline in the performance and sales of the Daily Mirror. So a newspaper of the left, a Labour-supporting newspaper, an EU-supporting newspaper, in principle, it is such a weak paper now. Its circulation is falling like a stone. It has almost no staff. It is in a very bad way, and it has no role in the referendum campaign at all, although it was nominally pro-EU. So the balance here is that tiny newspapers with very small circulations, The Guardian, the FT, are pro-Remain, and everything else, all the big guns, are Brexit papers. And then combine that with the change in the tone. These are desperate papers. All of their circulations are declining. Their kind of culture and mission is in question, and their response has been to become more and more hysterical. And the language, the treatment of facts, so forth. That's I think for me a kind of symptom of their desperation. But there's nothing you can do about it. As I say, you could have sent all the positive messages in the world to the Daily Mail. They would never have printed any of them. That wasn't on the agenda. I think, on our agenda today is social media and their role, and I'm very struck by there's a kind of conflict of metaphors here. I think, the social media side it's like termites, with lots and lots of tiny, tweeters creeping over the system, and they do provide some accountability for the press. They do provide some kind of calling out for the press. But you've also got to reckon with the other metaphor, which is the bubble, the filter bubble. And, Catherine Viner of The Guardian wrote about this soon after the vote. I was very conscious when I was on social media, I use Twitter a bit, that, you just don't see the messages from the other side. You even go out and look for them, and they're quite hard to find if you're not, used to it. So, I think for somebody like me who's trying to access it, I'm very conscious that it's possible, it's easy to be in your bubble and not see it. And so the termites might crawl away, but in the other bubble, as it were, they're not even seeing or hearing the termites, if that's not tangling the metaphor too much. Perhaps I should stop there and let you...
Okay, absolutely, but I think it's a point well taken about bubbles. Slightly off the topic of social media, but one that's certainly been on my mind, is if you look at, if we call us as a Brussels bubble, most of the people in this room will probably be reasonably described as members of the Brussels bubble. Some characteristics that I've certainly noticed, it's an exceptionally white bubble, for example, and to even work at most organizations related to the EU in this town, you certainly need a university degree, sometimes a higher level university degree. And if you look at the sort of people who have disengaged from the EU, they tend to have lower levels of educational attainment, and the population is certainly a lot more diverse out there across the European Union than it is just in the postcodes that we're in now. So let's switch from that level of elite to your level of elite, Anthony, a Western high pro-globalization economic organization, the OECD. What does this sort of post-fact tide mean for an organization that is data-driven, that is fact-driven, that's trying to advise people based on things that we can really grip when there are so many ungrippable things at the moment?
It's a big question. I don't know how long we've got.
And you may have some slides.
There's one or two things just to illustrate certain points, because there's lots of things you can say with a picture. Well, firstly, thank you very much. I think it's really good that an ombudsman is organising this, because probably that role is one that needs to be reinforced in many places. I think what we're lacking at the moment is people who have a legitimacy in a sense to arbitrate, and roles of that type we know they're important institutionally, and we also know they're important in the media. I used to be a member of the Brussels bubble for many years. I spent basically from the early 1990s and through to the early noughties. And then I pulled away from Brussels. I stayed connected to the EU, but from different vantage points. And what it means is that what I'm going to say will connect in a little bit to that, but it might be a little bit different in terms of the slant I take, but at least with that background. We're confronting a situation which is a really, it's a bummer. It's a very difficult situation that we're in right now. And I think there are many reasons why we've got to this pass. Let's kick off maybe from the perspective of media. And media is really important. It's really important to the OECD because we have no court of justice. We don't lend any money. So in terms of hard power, say the IMF lends money, World Bank lends money. The EU has the Court of Justice at the end of the day. You can like it, you cannot like it, but it's law and it's actionable. The OECD is entirely dependent on, well, entirely, it's very, very dependent on its soft power, which is influence, which is essentially making things known. And here I want to pick up on a very important distinction: information and meaning. Information and meaning. We conflate those things all of the time. We inevitably add value judgments. Ryan has just given his definition of the OECD. That's Ryan's definition. It's legitimate. I could ask all of you for a definition of the OECD or of the EU, and I can guarantee in this room we would have 150 different definitions. Is that fact? Is it based on fact? Is it truth? So these things, they pose some pretty difficult questions for us that we also have to separate out in a certain sense. I think we have a massive crisis of what you could consider to be trusted, trustable, provable information. and a protection of that space. That's very, very important for democracies to function. And I underline democracies as opposed to other political systems that don't at all depend on that. But obviously it's something that really needs to be protected. Meaning, on the other hand, is something that we all spend our entire time attaching to things all of the time. All of the time we're doing it. So is this good? Is this bad? Is this up? Is this down? Mediamorphosis we're in right now. Digitalization. Advent of social media a few years now. Internet well before. This is changing not only our consumption, not only our emission, our capacity to listen. Right now we have surfeits. There's too much. There is overload. How do you distinguish? How do you sift? Where does that take you? That can take you towards what you like. But then you're making a judgment. Siloization. We're living this right now, and it is exacerbated by social media. It's not created by social media. We have things that we like, and we have things that we like a little bit less. And the things that we like as human beings, we tend to gravitate around them. We have friends. Those friends are people that we like, you know. We don't necessarily agree on everything, but there's enough there to connect, right? And people that you don't like so much, you don't spend so much time with. So what human beings do, they extrapolate that onto social media, and it exacerbates it. And therefore, the degree to which you are going to seek opinion, meaning, and possibly information, from sources that you may have labeled in a certain way, will diminish. Will diminish because there's only so much time in the day, and who are you going to connect up with, and how are you going to do this? So that's something that I think is a very important phenomenon that we need to be aware of, and we need to be wary of at the same time. I also think that anthropologically we are entering into a space where we are developing a social media mindset as well. So the degree to which we feel responsibility when we're doing things now may have frayed at the edges. We can like things and we can unlike them. I think it was Xavier Bettel who told David Cameron, or it seemed to be directed at David Cameron, look, this isn't a Facebook status where it's complicated after the referendum result, but that was indicative of something. How many people after a referendum then started Googling to see what exactly the EU was? And how many people also felt that could they vote again? Would it be okay? Could they unlike one and perhaps go again? And I'm not going to go into the whys and wherefores, but it's symptomatic of something that we are seeing as well. And I think all of this stuff is conditioning the context that we operate in. Now, commonalities in some sense. The OECD is a far less politicized space than the EU. At least that's my experience of it now. Some of you may have long memories and may remember that the first international organization to be hit by the so-called modern anti-globalization movement was actually the OECD. I was gazing from a trade ministers meeting in Florence just before Seattle, WTO 1999. That was my baptism of fire. The first time I went to a WTO meeting, I was very excited. And it was very exciting. And many people remember it. But 1998, multilateral agreement on investments. And that was developed at the OECD. So the OECD was in the firing line then. Since then, a lot of things happened there. But the OECD is not anything like as politicized a space and an animal as the EU is, and therefore the meaning that people attach to the OECD is far less. The willingness to treat us as an information source that is reasonable and that is, how can I say, to a certain extent, you know, are we reasonably objective? Again, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but a lot of people seem to attach that label to us. And yet, we have had our difficulties. I want to just show something to you because I want to connect it up with Brexit. This is interesting just because it's taken from an article that I don't know how many of you read it, and then having read the Catherine Viner article in The Guardian and then read The Economist, I can't help thinking, blimey, there was a lot of things that were the same. But anyway, I don't know if there were letters to the editor on that one from Catherine. But just look at, there are 1.7 billion people on Facebook. And this is very revealing. The number of articles shared, meaning I'm sharing it. It's an active thing. I've read it, but I'm sharing it now. I am communicating it. I want you to listen. The same number of articles that are based on fact as are based on misrepresentation are shared. What does that mean? We're human beings. What we like is things that are maybe a little bit titillating. My colleague from ARD was saying, well, journalists, you know, we're based on fact. Well, Boris Johnson was back in the 90s. Okay, so this has been around a long time, and there's been a lot of journalism that's not necessarily been based on what we call serious information. There's a lot of journalism way back, right from the beginning, that has been seeking other things in order to sell papers and give people what they want. Okay, there's an element to that. Okay, that's your value judgment, and you're entitled to it, but it falls under that space. Now, the second thing I want to show you is really interesting because we entered into the Brexit space. We did it with a little bit of trepidation because we knew the OECD gets a very fair crack of the whip in all media around the world and in the British media. It gets a very fair hearing from The Sun, from the Daily Mail, from the Express. If you read those papers, Google OECD and obesity, Google OECD and pensions, Google OECD and education, they're very reasonable. In fact, they're quite critical of themselves, and they say, oh God, here we are again, look, you know, the OECD ranking, Britain's rubbish. And yet, and I knew this would be the case, and yet we enter into a space with Brexit where we produced a report on what would be the economic consequences of Brexit. We were seeking to produce information in a timely fashion for people to take an informed decision. Why? Because we knew the gravity of the decision, not just for the United Kingdom, but for the European Union as a whole. There are 22 out of 35 members of the OECD who are EU members, and the global economy. We care a lot about the global economy and its future, and as we all know, it's on life support. So if you give it a dirty, great big jolt, just when it's on life support, that could be a massive problem for everybody. Don't think local. Don't think this is some English thing or British thing or even European thing. This is far bigger than that, unfortunately, because of the consequences. It's a little bit like the tsunami and the nuclear accident on speed, and that was a natural disaster, and this is man-made. But just look at, this is an editorial. The Sun has an editorial opinion. I mean, you know. They took from our report to defend their view, their policy, their view on migration. As the OECD says, there are far too many migrants coming into the European Union, coming into the United Kingdom, sorry, from the European Union and other places. And secondly, but of course we dismiss completely the same report and its predictions regarding what the economic consequences could be. So you can see there a cherry picking that happens, which is, look, I've got a view and I'm going to fit the evidence or I'm going to fit the facts around that. And we came into that space and we were immediately labelled as EU funded. Immediately labelled as EU funded. We received some funding from European Union sources, but we are not EU funded. And yet the desire was to try and discredit from a very early stage. And so at that point, obviously, we found ourselves in a very complicated and difficult situation. I stop there because it's just to give you a little bit of some of the contours that we've been discussing here, but I think that there are some fundamental issues that we're looking at which are transversal, you know, whether it's Brexit or other manifestations that we're living at in terms of our societal trends.
Well, thank you to all of the panelists. Everyone up here has had a chance to make a contribution. I think it's time to grab some contributions from the audience, but please let them be a contribution with a question, not just a speech. And remember, there's a microphone next to you. Yes. And if you could introduce, it should be just in the side of the armrest. Yep, if you lift it up. There, yep. Yep. Yes, exactly. Yep. There's an on-off button on the side. There we go.
Just been here for a couple of weeks.
No problem.
My name is Elizabeth Hilgard. I'm from the Austria Press Agency. And as you know, we in Austria, we have a very strong right party. And I have the feeling they also have a very strong social media work. And I have the feeling that I agree with the bubble because I just get, as we saw like on the elections, you think there is going to be the Green president, but then you have like such strong support for the far right. But my question would be that I have the feeling these people who are living in a bubble, they get stronger at the moment you started criticizing them, or you started like saying you are not believing in the truth, you're not believing in the facts, and that's kind of feeding them, because no one wants to be wrong and no one wants to have the false opinion. So how are you? I think that's a very big challenge. And how are you? What's your idea of addressing that problem? Because they're like, you know, like a little child who thinks, no, I'm not wrong. And I do think that's a much bigger problem than we think.
And maybe if we take 2 more questions and then everyone can have a chance to respond. Is there anyone else that wanted to ask? Yes, Raymond.
Now it should
Yes,
work,
now it
yes.
is.
My name is Raymond Frank, and I'm a former journalist now working in communications for a private sector organization here in Brussels. As a correspondent working and covering the European Union, I must agree with Rolf Dieter that it was always very difficult to get good comments from the European Union, and that when you start voicing criticism, you were also isolated as a journalist and you were given less access to this. What I still notice is that anybody criticizing the European Union is basically stripped out from the discussion. Why does the EU and the EU spokespeople in particular, why do they not embrace that criticism as an opportunity to explain what the real intention is of certain policies or certain opinions? Because I feel there's too much of the attitude in the European institutions saying that anybody criticizing is against us, so we should no longer work with them. We should only fund and support media that are friendly to us, like some websites, like Euronews. They get all the funding, and they get all the access. But those who are critical, they don't get the access, and therefore are left on their own to find a story that may not be the real story, simply because they do not have the proper access. I think that's one aspect of many aspects in the discussion, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And is there a third contribution? Yes, the gentleman in the middle there.
Is that on? Yeah. Sorry, just on that. I think a lot of the outrage can be traced back to the banking crisis. Is there the outrage that exists, especially on social media, and the breakdown in trust that people are feeling? Do you think that this can be traced back to the austerity that was foisted on people in order to pay for the mistakes of the massive banks and the risks that they took? I just make it in the context of the previous contribution.
Okay. Isabel, maybe I'll start with you. It's been a while since you spoke, and there were a couple of EU-related questions.
Yeah, I will answer in particular the 2 first questions. I think you have really a point, and it was also mentioned by colleagues here. The issue of the gap between the elite and the people is a real issue. I mean, it's not only with regard to EU. I mean, if you look at the US campaign, it's exactly what happened. You have on one side the establishment, the elite, and the real people. And the real people now do not trust the elite anymore and are fighting against them. And just because you are part of the elite, what you say does not count anymore. And so it's there that it's really important to reconnect. And to reconnect with all the people. You rightly mentioned that there is the Brussels bubble. I'm a bit out of the bubble because now I'm in Paris, and it's true that when you look at it from the outside, sometimes you see a little, it's not exactly the same. I mean, and now looking at it from a capital, you really have to re-explain on a much more basic way and what the EU is doing. And you have to explain that in your own language. I mentioned that because it's really something which is important. You cannot say that you connect with people, that you are close to people if you do not speak their language. If you look at EU websites, it's almost impossible to find an information in another language than English. You have some French, but not much, and that's almost all. So how can you say, well, you will explain, and I know that it's always very, people here in Brussels, when you speak about language, well, it's too much, it's too complicated, and it's true. It's extremely complicated to work in 22 languages. But it is the only way if you want to reach people. I mean, in France, if I sent a link with an article or with a news page on the website of the Commission in English, I'm sure that I will receive immediately very bad comment. So this is an issue. If you want to bridge this gap between the elite and the Brussels bubble and the people, you have to speak their language. And you have to speak in a language, not only their mother tongue, but also a language that they understand. And it's true that sometimes what we produce here in Brussels is not so clear. So we have to re-explain it in a way that people would understand. On the fact that we do not like contradiction, and once you have a critique, you are put out of the circuit. I mean, we, at least in France, in the way we work in the Commission in France, we have a different experience. We have, for example, on TTIP. TTIP is an issue which is extremely debated in France, not only in France. I know that it's in Austria, it's the same, and in Germany as well. But we have decided to engage a discussion. And I have in my team somebody who is fully dedicated to it, who goes to all kind of meetings with people who are not on the same idea and who debates. And you very often get extremely good quote from them. They are not on the same opinion, but at least they speak, they debate, and they confront ideas. And this is democracy. And this is what the EU should be. So I think we should not avoid debate. The debate is part of democracy, but we should also say that when decisions are taken in the democratic way, they have to be followed, because this is also democracy. So, well, these are the 2 points I wanted to make. On debate, I had another experience recently in France. We had the Nuit debout discussion, and on 9th of May we have our traditional Feast of Europe, and we had people from Nuit debout inviting the debate space that we had, and say, okay, well, you want to debate, let's debate. And we have had a very interesting debate with them. It was on migration again, with an Italian MP who really wanted to debate, and in the end it made something. So this is how I think EU institutions shouldn't fear the debate, and we can discuss. We have good ideas, we have good arguments, and we can debate. I mean, I'm not afraid of that.
Emily, maybe if I can bring you in quickly here. So drawing on those questions, Isabel saying that people need to jump into the debate as EU officials. Do you feel, as an ombudsman, as someone who's really supposed to be very specifically neutral and arbitrating, that you can express that sort of passion to be part of this more political world or commission that Jean-Claude Juncker has said needs to exist, or are you inherently stuck being unable to do that? And that's why we're all talking about it instead. Yeah,
no, what comes across to me sometimes, and just even from what I've been hearing over the last few minutes, is a sense of defeatism from the EU in relation to their capacity to engage at the level in which I think we all agree needs to be engaged. One of the things that the Daily Mail and other tabloid newspapers or whatever are very good at is creating chaos and drama around what they do. Now, EU institutions can't. They're limited in terms of the chaos and drama that they can that they could engage with. But it strikes me is that the EU simply isn't on the pitch and is afraid to go onto the pitch, on the playing field in relation to that. And I noticed it very much when I remember talking to a few MEPs around Brexit, and some of them had plans to go and actually fight the good fight on behalf of Remain in the UK, and they were encouraged not to. It was as if the EU felt it had to keep its head down because they were being so vilified and so on. And I think that is a very poor attitude to adopt. And when we talk about facts, and people not willing to engage around them, or if you put the facts out, they're ignored. Well, if you look at the first Clinton-Trump debate, when Trump was the one with all the drama and the chaos, and out of that attracting a huge support, obviously, and still, though possibly not as much as he did because of recent events, what you saw happen in that is that Clinton trumped him with the facts. And why did that happen? And I think it possibly did shift the waivers, perhaps those who had doubts about Clinton. I don't know. We'll find out ultimately, I suppose, more in her direction. But at least there was a forum there which was being watched by possibly the highest ever number of people who were watching a TV program, or certainly a US presidential debate, where the facts could be put out there, where people who would normally avoid them or listen to one particular side of the argument were, in a sense, forced to listen to them. But I don't think perhaps that the EU institutions, and based on what some of the colleagues are saying, are finding those places, finding those arenas, finding those pitches in which they can actually take those arguments to the people who are instead fed the sort of media diet that is being fed. I mean, obviously, as Ombudsman, as you say, and I'm an EU body as well, and I have to be careful in terms of what I say, but I still think that you can put your points of view across, put your arguments across in a way that does engage, and that's certainly something that I've been doing. And one of the things I've done in terms of the communications is I've stopped bringing out all those boring leaflets and so on, and most of our engagement takes place on Twitter, social media, and so on, where we actively try to engage. Though I was at a conference just the other day, and somebody asked me if I'd noticed that I had 15,000 Twitter followers and Nigel Farage had, 2.5 million or something like that, which was an unfair comparison, obviously. But the point is that when you think about what Nigel Farage does, he engages on several levels, from show business to high politics, and therefore, obviously, he's going to engage on that. But if the EU institutions restrict themselves to just engaging in dry facts, which I know is really what they should be doing, but it is leaving the game and the winners to those people who try and engage on a more emotional level. So the EU really has to try and engage on that level much more.
Then I've got a question, and maybe get quick reactions from everybody on this question. So, if you were to engage in new ways or with new people, could you turn around how the EU is perceived if you were to hire a very prominent, very well-loved figure to be a national spokesperson in each of the EU countries for the EU? Could you bring in a big journalist like an Anne Sinclair in France, or some very famous actor in the UK? And I know that many of you have reported from a national level. Some of you have been spokespeople from a national level. You Isabel, have your own arrangements now for who you send out in front of the media. If you put someone of that nature, or you brought in those YouTube stars who worked with Juncker after the State of the Union, if you had people of that style and caliber being the face of the EU, could that make a dent in this new environment? And maybe, Brian, we can just walk.
I wouldn't want to be that person I mean, nobody would ask me, but I would feel sorry for that person in the UK. I mean, this is it's a kind of
someone does act as the spokesperson now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not
but
of that.
It is a kind of it's funny, but it's not funny, because that person would be eviscerated. Their private lives would be, just destroyed, honestly or dishonestly, certainly improperly and unethically, without a shadow of doubt. I don't think what you need is is a kind of national treasure spokesman. I just don't think that would work. And I feel sorry for the EU in this the EU institutions in this situation, because in a sense I don't think it's really in their hands. I mean, the two questioners, the lady from Austria and the gentleman from Ireland, raised this question of alienation. People are alienated, and the banking crisis, I think, did a lot to contribute to that. The EU didn't make the banking crisis. But you detach the idea that a lot of people are alienated and angry, and the idea that they are somehow blaming the EU for it. I think we need to go for the people who are propagating the lies, and we need to tackle them. And I think it's very difficult, it would be very difficult in the British context for the EU to come in, as it were, muscle-bound and say, have an aggressive spokesman tackling the Daily Mail. I think you would just be playing into their hands. I feel sympathy for the people who were told that it wasn't a good idea to go and participate in the campaign as EU representatives. But I think it was probably smart advice. I think that tackling the liars and fueling the people who are tackling the liars, if we can get enough of them, is the way to do it, or at least is one of the best ways to do it. And I think that's kind of everyone's responsibility. And I see the termites, as very important in this. I think the EU can certainly join the fight for facts and support that, but I think it's a matter of support rather than leadership.
Isabel.
Yeah, I would go in the same way, but maybe not as bad, looking at the French situation. I would say, well, first of all, it's important, and you mentioned that as well, Emily, that at national level there is endorsement and ownership. You cannot, the best EU spokesperson would never have the same level of, will not be heard the same way as a national leader. So it's necessary to have a real ownership of the national leader, be them on duty or even in the opposition. And now what we see in the current campaign, which is beginning in France, the EU subject is really dividing both camps, the right, the left. I don't speak about the extreme right because there this is clear. But in the middle of the right and in the middle of the left, you have pro and cons EU, and it's dividing each camp. So it's important that the people who are really pro EU speaks. They start to do even in the campaign. But this is the first thing: ownership from the national politician. Second thing I would say is to also have the people who have confidence from the people who can speak. In France, there is general distrust in the politician, with one exception, which is the very local level, the mayor. There is 80% of the French people who trust their mayor, because they are next to them, they try to find solutions to problems, and they are concrete people. So this is one of our targets.
So that becomes clearer, your earlier point then, in a way, not that you've abandoned having a national spokesperson, but you're via local media placement and going through local ambassadors.
Yes, we try to have local people who have confidence from people and who can also speak concretely of what the EU is doing. And the third level is also the emotional level. Try to find people who are loved by normal people and who can be heard. We are trying with cartoonists. You perhaps know Plantu, who is one of the most well-known cartoonists in France from Le Monde. 2 days after Brexit, he came to see me and say, "What can I do for you?" Yeah, it's one of
partly
the
it,
national
yes.
treasure, and he came spontaneously and say, well, we know that the European project is in danger. We are some cartoonists and we want to work with you. So we are working with him. We will make a conference in 2 weeks' time with Vice President Timmermans and him. Discussing, and I think cartoonist might be a good way, because it's love, and what people, in particularly the extreme right, is doing is playing with fear, and one of the best remedy to fear is love. It's we have currently a Harry Potter new because it has just been translated in French, and everybody speaks of Harry Potter in France currently. If you read Harry Potter, what they use to fight fear is love, and I think it's extremely efficient. This is one of the national treasure we will try to use, because and it works. We had a very good fact-checking made by France 2 on concumber. You know, this concumber story that all politicians spread around, that EU is doing nothing but dealing with concumber, and Sarkozy recently made it again, and there was a very good and very funny answer made by France Télévisions on concumber, which was really extremely funny, and that was the best answer, because then people laugh and say, well, okay, this is the end of it.
Speaking of fact-checking, John Worth in the audience fact-checked Nigel Farage's follow account, and it's only 484,000. So you've almost caught up, Emily. Rolf Dieter, any reactions from you?
Yeah, from my point of view, our public debates quite generally do not fit anymore to the situation we are really in Europe. I say debates, not debate, because we have different national public debates. And the real situation of all of us is that our nations are interdependent in an enormous scale. Companies are interdependent. British car makers, car producers import 75% of the parts of their cars from other European countries. And vice versa, when you buy a Volkswagen, you buy parts from almost all EU countries. And so, but our debates are always only national. We treated the British referendum campaign only as a British issue. No foreign politician intervened. While it was clear that any result would mean a lot, not only for Britain, but also for all of us others. So I think this has to change. We need a European public debate. And I know these panel discussions about a European public sphere, or however you may call it, this will be very difficult to create it. But what is possible is that the actors are acting not only on their national level. So what do I mean? My experience as a correspondent was that here in Brussels, I got every German to our cameras and microphones if I wanted and if they were here. Sometimes they changed their agenda to make it possible that they could give us an interview. But when we tried to get a member of the European Parliament coming from Spain or Finland or whatsoever, it turned out to be very difficult to get them, not because of the different languages and so on. This is one point which you can't change. I guess the reason is simply via a German TV, a Finnish politician doesn't reach out to his voters. But in Europe, this doesn't fit anymore. We tried with, we had we were lucky enough. We were not only correspondents here. We produce our own program, a magazine on European affairs. We have the opportunity to transport different views to our German audience. But the carriers of these different views made it extremely difficult to us to do that. Commissioners, yeah, we had some from different nationality in our program, but it needed sometimes weeks before to get them, and for an actual program, this is simply not possible. So I would say that the actors have to change, and you can't talk any longer about internal affairs in European countries. We have no internal affairs. It does matter whether Germany is ruled by Merkel or someone else, to Italians, to Greeks, and so on. To me, it is important whether you have in Rome a Berlusconi or a Renzi, or in France a Sarkozy or Hollande, or maybe a Juppé or whomever, and so on. It does matter to me as a German that whether Britain is in or out of the EU. So we have no internal affairs, but our debate, our public debate, does not fit to that fact, and this has to change. This is, in my view, would be much more effective than to have prominent persons who would argue in favor of the EU, because, as you have heard, it is so easy to label you as EU-funded or biased and so on. No, you need the struggle of different opinions, but this must be an international struggle.
Anthony.
It's two questions that I wanted to pick up on. Ryan, you asked about the sort of the high-profile people, and the gentleman in the audience who asked about trust. And I really want to come back to that, the question of the global financial crisis 2008, because I think there's a lot behind that. If I'd had a magic wand, I would have organized a campaign, and I would have deployed all of the high-profile European footballers who played in the Premier League in England in the last 20, 30 years and made it the wonderful thing that it is today. And I would have plastered them all over Sunderland, Leeds, Newcastle, all of the places that nobody ever gets to. And mea culpa, the OECD, when we did our presentation of our study, where did we do it? London School of Economics. Very learned. My father taught there for 40 years. Brilliant place. Excellent. Where did we go? London. Oh, excellent. We didn't go to Leeds. I suggested going to Leeds. The Secretary General of the OECD is a Mexican. He studied in Leeds in 1972. Leeds was not a pretty place necessarily in 1972. They didn't have a bad football team, but it wasn't, the most exotic place ever. Had he gone up there, I don't know, might have made a bit of a difference, but that's a lesson. You go to the same places, the places that we feel comfortable in, the elite places, and I think that there is a lot to that we need to think about. So picking up on this point, yes, you go popular. You ask a Gianfranco Zola to promote. You ask a David Ginola to do so. Why? Because people know who they are. And if they make the connection and say, the reason why I was able to come and play in Newcastle for 5 years and it was wonderful and I learnt Geordie and I drank their beer and everything, it's because of a ruling by the European Court of Justice that allowed footballers to be able to ply their trade anywhere in the European Union. There is a nice story behind it. That's what you need to do. You need to make a connection between something that's real world, that somebody likes, that they really take for granted, and they don't know that you take it back, and there is a reason why that happened. There are a bunch of things like that, which I think that the European Union has done well in recent years, focusing on roaming charges, focusing on protecting consumers, on overbooking, cleanliness of beaches. Some of these things people may consider to be very prosaic in this environment, and I may consider it to be very prosaic when you're talking about international trade and the investor state provisions in TTIP. Well, good luck talking to somebody down the pub on the investor state provisions and also telling them that there's not going to be any problem around it. Because there are problems around these things, because they're super complex. And we live in an environment, I think Daniel Kahneman called this, we like cognitive ease. We don't like complicated things, we want easy things. But things are not necessarily easy, and what do we do about those? Do we leave them at a certain point? Let me come very quickly to the question of trust, because I think the reason that we're in the situation that we're in now in 2016 is it's been brewing for some time. Latest iteration for me, certainly I would date it from 2008. And I'll give you a microcosmic example. And let's go back in history as well. Sometimes my problem is I think I know too many things, which sounds very arrogant. Why is it that the European Union enlarged? Who was one of the most important politicians in encouraging the enlargement of the European Union? Can anybody hazard a guess? Margaret Thatcher. Conservative. Why? You could argue that she wanted to bring the former communist countries into the fold. Some argued that it was to dilute the European project of Delors at the time. Which country did not put in any controls on migration flows between 2004 and 2016 and had 4 opportunities to do so? Sorry? I can't hear you. And you're laughing. Who admits this stuff? People have said honesty at national level. Okay, it's not run of the mill, and then you get a lack of trust. And I'll hold a hand up for the OECD on this. It's an unintended thing, but it's a resource thing as well. But we've got to get wise to this. We don't go local enough in our analysis. So, for example, we will say, and it is true, that the budgetary impact of migration is positive, and if at a push it's going to be neutral. So it's all good. What we don't do is look at the local impacts, as in migration doesn't work at just a national level. It goes local. So if you've had 7 or 8 years of austerity, where public services funding has been cut or not increased over 7 or 8 years since 2008, migration flows continue into many different places, and those migration flows are not controlled intra-country, you can get certain concentrations occurring where there are a lot of people coming in and the public services, in the people's perception, they go down. And that is something also where you need to look at things in an honest way. Second element on trust is that globalization on many occasions overpromised. For example, at a certain point, I was involved in trade negotiations for many years. And the fashion for anyone involved in them was that trade negotiations was going to solve all the world's problems. You know, liberalize trade, and we'd be able to do all sorts of wonderful things. When I got involved, it was, you know, there was some conscience coming through, you know, all environmental standards, labor standards, a whole bunch of things coming through. But I think at a certain point, a lot of the globalization promises may have been overpromised on, and some of the downside elements more difficult. And perception here is really important. Ryan, at the beginning, talked about how people are feeling on things. And I think, you know the expression, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. I think most people would rather not have something than have something and have it taken away. Then they react badly. And I think that may be part of what we're living now, because the major problem we have in terms of trust is not in India, not in China, not necessarily in Mexico or in Chile or in Thailand. The major problem of trust we have is in Western democracies whose lower middle classes and working classes now feel that they're getting the bum rap out of globalization. And they are able to hold the global system hostage in a sense, because all of those leaders at the G7 and the G20 are disproportionately European, American, etc., and they will be very responsive to what those people say. You know, if you're sitting there and you're Brazilian going, God, you think you've got problems, or China, you know, you think you've got problems, that's going to cause difficulties. We have processes of globalization that are operating at a global level and have been for many years, and our politics have remained assiduously national, and that is a tension. I don't have a solution to that tension necessarily. So either you go one way, you somehow globalize the governance, that people's eyes glaze over and they go, oh my God, you know, that's awful, because how do you reconcile that with going local? Or you may have a trend where people are looking actually to say, well, this is all getting very uncomfortable, and I'm no longer so comfortable with all of this. And it's schizophrenia, because it's the same person who loves flying, taking all the flights around Europe, and, you know, it's open skies and it's all great. And on the other side of the brain, they're going, oh no, but I'm uncomfortable with things. So that's a very complicated situation.
Okay, think it's time for some more questions or contributions from the audience. And I won't limit it here, but I did want to put a call out to the people who actually do work for the EU institutions doing social media. And so I'm talking about you, Amy Burnett, Pablo Perez, Daria Santucci, Tom Moylan, Magda from the Council. If any of you are out there, please feel very encouraged to tell us what's your experience of actually trying to deal with this debate online. And I can see Alice Stolmeyer as well, who's an outside blogger and social media activist, let's say. So let's start with you, Alice, and then please get... yeah.
Hello?
Normally takes 1 or 2 seconds, but...
Oh,
yes,
yeah,
there
now
we
it's
go.
working. Yeah, hi. So my name is Alice Stolmeyer. I'm an independent blogger and tweeter about European energy and climate policies. One of the things, this is not going to make things easier, but some things have not been come up in the discussion yet, which are, for example, Russian trolls and tweet bots. I've seen both in the Dutch-Ukraine referendum discussion and in the British referendum debate, and now in the US elections debate. I see on social media, well, mainly Twitter, because that's where I work mostly, you can see that there are huge numbers of Russian trolls active, meddling in political debates. And there are even tweet bots active. And I have no idea how we can deal with this, but somehow for me, I connect this with what Vice President Kristalina Georgieva recently said. She says, hate is loud and it's everywhere. Love or goodness is our job to amplify. But then the question is, how do you amplify this on social media when you know there's like troll factories out there or tweet bots out there? Can that be like, can we create good tweet bots? And if so, would that be a solution? I don't have the answer, but it's something I'm wondering. Thanks.
And sometimes it's not necessarily even the bots. I have seen in the last week, whoever it is, I have no idea, but clearly falsified emails claiming to come from John Podesta, Hillary's chief of staff, to people at Politico when they didn't even work at Politico on the dates that the emails are said to have come. And it looks really quite sophisticated, and your reaction is, but then you look at it and you're like, well, that's absurd. He doesn't even know who that person is, and that person didn't work here at that time, and the address is a bit silly. But, you know, it's clearly very, very sophisticated levels of misinformation circulating. Yeah. Yep. Have we got another question out there? Florian.
Okay. There it is. Thank you, Claudia. Yes, I'm Florian. I'm a former journalist, then worked for the Commission for some time, and now work at Oxfam on media and social media. We've heard from the beginning, and then again and again, that the EU is skeptics, and I think this is something you can also say for other topics like those opposing migration to Europe and other topics, that they are very well organized. And I was wondering, so apparently there are others who are not that organized, who don't make their voices heard. Is it possible to get them? Do you do something to get these people speak in the public and support the other side?
Who wants to go first?
Maybe the first question on Russia. It's indeed an issue. It's also an issue at national level. I mean, some EU countries are more touched than others, but I would say, well, recently I thought that French was a bit out of it, but actually not. Well, first of all, there are very close links between Russia and Front National. And it's true that there is propaganda and well, just an information that maybe you don't have. The EIS has created a task force on that to fight against Russian propaganda and try to disseminate more information on what EU is rightly doing. But this is indeed an issue. I don't have any answers, but just that indeed this is a question.
Maybe let's do a quick poll of the audience there, because I know I'm aware that there is this team on Russian disinformation inside the institutions, but how many of you have, first of all, have you heard that such a thing exists? Okay, good, okay, that's a majority. How many of you ever actually have used or come across the material that is supposed to correct the misinformation? Much smaller group, but still a few of you. Okay. Is there anyone else wanting to react to those questions? No, maybe we'll take another question then. Sorry, the gentleman on the right, Tony Connolly in the front, and then the younger gentleman up the back. Which means
Thank you.
It's going to be all women in the next round, by the way.
Didier Jans, Industrial Minerals Association. Several of the speakers have highlighted the need for Europe to speak out and to go out and to speak to the public. I have a question there, and maybe a real question mark. When you compare the kind of information which is circulating and of interest to this kind of media we are talking about, I wonder whether the Europe is equipped for that. I fear we very often have very arid, technocratic message and so on. There is no room for that in this media. What can we do? Sorry, this microphone is really not working well. What can we do really to overcome this situation? Have we any chance, or is this battle a little bit desperate? Since I have the mic, I also would like to maybe to raise a reflection on the point that was raised by Mrs. Jegouzou on the languages. It's not only complicated. I fear one of the things we are facing here is a question of identity, a European identity. You mentioned rightly the good effect that the Erasmus has had. I guess this is putting its roots in the European structure, but it takes time. We had the single currency. With the challenge that we are facing now, would it not be time to think about a common language? I mean, not only here in Brussels, but at European level?
Tony.
Yeah, Tony Connolly is my name. I work for RTE, which is Ireland's public broadcaster. I just wanted to put you on the spot a little, Ryan. There have been various criticisms of the spokesperson service, not enough people, not responsive enough, and timorous when it comes to the big debates. When you worked for the spokesperson service for a while, I'd be curious about your own response to some of those criticisms. Thank you.
Maybe I'll quickly respond to that, and then we'll come to you, I promise. And on the point of the arid communication as well. Yes, I would say that the spokesperson service probably overcorrected from some of the flaws that those of us who were in the Barroso Commission, we knew that they existed. We knew that the messages weren't coherent enough, and probably that it wasn't acting in a political enough fashion to really cut through. So that was clear at the time. To then kind of really shrink the number of spokespeople in the way that Rolf Dieter was suggesting wasn't very effective. I think it's true. It was an overcorrection, and I have also certainly experienced from the outside as a journalist not being invited to certain things. So it's not necessarily that you're cut off if you criticize. It's that if you don't demonstrate that you are, quote, a trusted journalist, you don't get access in the first place to certain types of briefing and so on. And then sometimes the point of those off-the-record or background briefings, and this is certainly not limited to the European Commission spokesperson service, but the point of those briefings, the positive way of seeing it is to build trust between journalists and political figures. And the negative way of seeing it is that, of course, if you are brought into that beautiful, elite, cozy conversation that only very few people are entitled to become a part of, then you obviously have a built-in incentive to not break the bonds of that access and that trust and say something nasty about those people who've invited you to those beautiful, cozy rooms to tell you all those important things that they don't want you to then express afterwards. So, I mean, I'm not trying to say that one is 100% good and one is 100% bad, but you have to be very conscious about those dynamics that are at play when you engage in those relationships, and probably, and perhaps the Ombudsman will back me up here, institutions, including the EU, need to be a bit more transparent about how some of those relationships work. Otherwise, you feed that mistrust that goes on.
Ryan, do you mind if I
yeah, of course.
pick up on this? Because my memory is a little bit less recent, but the practice, I was a spokesman during the Prodi Commission on International Trade. And Beata in the front row was with me doing Mad Cow and some really complicated issues on health. Yeah, I mean, you know, life and death stuff. I was doing international agreements, which is not life and death. It's not quite the same thing. I'll tell you, Brussels for journalists was a sieve. I have journalists in the family. I've been a journalist in other times in my life. One of the best journalists in the press room at the time. He got every single document from the Commission. We didn't know how he did it. And he just used the system. He had a wonderful, literally, delivery people who provided everything to him. It may be that since then, things have tightened up radically. However, given that you have a College of Commissioners, how many?
28.
28 sources from which you can get stuff. I don't know how many conduits that you could possibly do to try and run the Alistair Campbell or the Karl Rove operations that I lived in my time in the EU when Tony Blair in Downing Street or George Bush in Washington. It was impossible for us to do anything of that type. Not only impossible, but it's great that we couldn't do anything like that, because that's not what you should be doing. Controlling in that way, spinning in that way is not I think, what things are about. And so I would invite anybody to compare the practices that take place and have taken place at national level and the ability to freeze people out. I know this, Helen Thomas, a legendary journalist in the White House press room, 40 years experience, Pulitzers, everything, frozen out for 4 years under the George Bush administration. Nothing like that. I have seen anything the like of it here. So it's just a word of caution. Are we being a little bit too critical here? Because in terms of the experiences that you can have in certain places, access to information, whether it's through the official sources or whether you're a good journalist and you do your job and you get it somewhere or another, I just wonder about the degree of criticism that one can level at what happens here in Brussels. I think this is a goldmine for journalists.
That's not the point, if I may. Of course, there are places in the world where the situation is much worse. But that's not the question. The EU is in real danger. And the question is, do the institutions respond to that in the best way possible? And there the answer is no. There are better ways. That's what I say. I don't criticize the Commission for being like the Kremlin or whatsoever. Do they do their best to save these European projects? That's the point. And they do not.
Yes, there was one point that I wanted to make about the way of communicating, and absolutely. I think sometimes individuals in the system, maybe they underestimate the level of agency or power they have in the system to change course or to say no to certain requests or demands that are put on them. And an example I'll give is when I would fill in sometimes as the temporary spokesperson or the backup spokesperson during summer months for economy, so Eurozone, this crisis and that crisis related to the economy and finance. And of course, what you have in the system is that the staff will advisors will prepare draft lines for potential questions that might come. We're going to just have one conversation, actually. Sorry if I'm boring. And then we can have all our extra conversations afterwards. So you are told what might be the potential questions. You can obviously read from the morning's news, what might be followed up by journalists, and draft materials are prepared in the course of the morning. But there always comes a point where you as an individual spokesperson have to decide, are you going to read these words out to a question? And one of the times that, and I don't say it to make myself a hero, but it just frustrated me this particular time, where there had been some new Spanish unemployment figures. The figures had gone up. Spain was in the middle of negotiating support so that its economy didn't collapse and it didn't get into the sort of the Greek bailout sort of zone. And it was just a process draft that had been handed to me. And I just said, well, I'm not going to read that out. You know, I'm going to say, well, essentially sympathize with people who might have lost their job and then read out the line. And then the message would come back to me, but that's not the line, you can't do that. And then I just said, well, like, you're not the one standing in front of the camera, I am. And I'm not going to read those words out. And I think that sometimes people don't remember that they have the power to actually have that response in a situation like that, regardless of other pressures that are on the system. So yes, you can end up in arid communication because sometimes there are just boring legal texts that have to be read out so that you don't find yourself in court in 2 years' time. But you know, at the end of the day, we're all people and we're all trying to get along with each other. And you've got to remember that the person that you're talking about, the people that you're trying to communicate to, that they have feelings as well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel slightly straight into somebody else's argument here. I've never worked in Brussels, okay? But I have edited on the other end and dealt with, you know, European stories in various ways. And, you know, I'm sure that there are lots of ways in which EU communications could be improved. But, you know, the gentleman asked, you know, it comes over as arid and technocratic. Isn't it? I mean, isn't that what it's about? Okay. There are lots of important things about Europe, but the actual clunking working here is pretty arid and technocratic, isn't it? Isn't that, you know, let's not try and gild it. Let's not try and wrap it up and pretend it's cuddly. It's not. It's arid and technocratic. It's a hard story to tell. It's a hard story to tell well. And I sympathise with people in Brussels who are working on getting these stories. I'm sure it is a goldmine. I know it's a goldmine of stories. But, I think, you know, let's be realistic here. I think that there are much bigger issues here, and the idea of European identity. I mean, I think it's not really about the EU Commission's communications addressing this big issue of alienation. That is about national leadership. That is about European leadership. And, you know, conveying to the public something that was conspicuously absent in the UK before the referendum, but is, I think, you know, hanging in the air like, you know, a very dark cloud. Conveying the idea that we are now in a world where we have problems and we blame foreigners. We blame foreign institutions, we blame immigrants. Conveying the kind of serious meaning of that is not the responsibility of journalists or, you know, EU spokesmen. It is the responsibility of the people who lead us. And, you know, I think you know, we're more likely to get somewhere if people realise what's at stake.
Well, no, not much to add, actually. I completely share your views. I mean, it's also what I previously said. The best EU spokesperson would do nothing if, at national level, people continue to say "they in Brussels" instead of "we in Europe." And I think this is the key. They in Brussels, it's what have been told to people for years. When politicians come back from a council or a European council, if it ended well, they said, "I fight it well and I win against the other." So it's not the we either. Or they say, "Well, the decision is bad and I will continue to oppose." But the question of ownership is a real question. And if this is not addressed, it's true that the European project is at stake.
And I mean, just as kind of statistics, underlying some of this, I don't know how widely known it is that in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote, there was a 40% increase in reported hate crimes in the UK. And that tailed off and levelled out at a level 15% higher than before. This is serious.
Oh, yes, sorry, we'll take one question over here, and then I had one of my own that I was going to inject.
My name is Fergal O'Regan. I work for the European Ombudsman, not in the area of communications, at least not directly. President Obama made a very powerful speech in the last number of days where he pointed out to the Republican Party that the rise of Trump was not something that was unexpected, that the Republican Party had fed the tiger, had ridden the tiger for years, the tiger of populism, and now they risked being eaten by that tiger. You can see the same thing happening in the United Kingdom, in France, and other member states, where centre-right, centre-left parties are feeding the tiger, they're riding the tiger, and the tiger may come around and eat them, or maybe unfortunately might eat us. Isn't it the case, and I think it's been referred to by a number of the panel, that it is at national level and even at local level that this must be addressed. And it must be addressed in a way which points out to people that if they feed the tiger, if they ride the tiger, eventually it will come around and destroy them. And we see with the Conservative Party that they are almost becoming more UKIP than UKIP itself, where we see hate crime, even hints of it being incorporated into official policy of what would otherwise be mainstream parties. And we see it in France as well. I know from my own experience, about 7 years ago, I took leave from the Ombudsman to campaign in Ireland, in the west of Ireland, down in Tralee and Galway and Limerick. And it is very difficult as an individual EU official or as institutions to make this argument. I was on local radio debating with Declan Ganley, our version of Farage, and he said, "What are you doing here? You're EU official." And it's reasonably easy to counteract it by saying, "Well, I'm actually from here." But it's not as easy to do it as would be the case for a local politician. And that's where we need to, I believe, it's been referred to already, and I admire the efforts of the Commission and representation in France to get to where it really matters. We can make all the efforts we can in the institutions, but we won't be listened to because it's easy to disqualify us. We need national politicians and national figures to realise that they must do this, and if they don't do it, the tiger may come and eat them as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The question I will throw out to the panel, as well as reactions to that view, it's the question of how would you define balance when it comes to either traditional journalism or discussion in social media? Is it a balance between competing facts? Is it a balance between two equal or unequal sides? Does balance matter at all? And the reason I asked that question is we saw some of the figures that Mr. Gooch put up behind us, and I also saw some work by a great German media research company called Media Tenor, and they made me look at this issue in a different way, which was, and it gets back to that kind of enabling question as well, which is that the BBC, theoretically being balanced, actually ended up giving a lot more coverage than it probably intended to the Leave campaign in the course of the referendum. And a lot of people who have been writing about Donald Trump, especially during the initial stages of his candidacy, this research started to put dollar values on how much free publicity individual journalists were giving Donald Trump. So not to say that they were acting in a pro-Donald Trump way, but the effect was by giving him, upwards of $2, $4, $5 million of free publicity sometimes with their articles or their broadcasts, that the effect was to be pro-Trump because he ended up getting more coverage than anyone else, because he was obviously good for ratings and good for readership. But I hadn't seen before people starting to sort of pin down with numbers and concrete research that balance sometimes isn't the balance that the people trying to create it were expecting to create. Sorry, that almost was nonsensical English. over to you guys. Maybe Anthony and Rolf Dieter on your side.
You can do a he said, she said journalism, and this is certainly balanced. And I didn't watch, you mentioned the BBC, and I earlier thought that in times where it's becoming difficult, maybe really mass media and TV is still a mass medium, are becoming more and more important. And I didn't watch everything the BBC broadcasted during the referendum campaign, but my impression was that they tried to be fair by doing a he said, she said journalism. But another question is it correct what he or she said? And in my view, journalists have to deliver what is right and what is wrong. And of course, in the long run, you must be trustworthy, and this is decided by your audience. But in my view, it is not sufficient just to quote what he or she said. You have the same problem now in the United States, because if you say what he or she said is not true, then you get blamed to be unfair or so. No, it is not unfair to tell the truth, and there you have to stand for what you are doing. So a balanced journalism would, in my view, go far beyond that he said, she said thing, and I think this is also compared to social media, because of course we have a democratization of communication. On Twitter, everybody can tell what he wants to tell, and this appears to be on the same level and so on. I think if journalists want to get paid for their work, and this is the difference between someone who writes just tweets for private pleasure, then we have to deliver more than he or she said. Then balance, and certainly we have to stand for what we are doing, and maybe we get blamed if we are wrong, but we are human beings. But I think we have to try to transport facts. Yeah, and since life is factual and not post-factual, I'm quite confident that factualism will regain field, as I said earlier.
Anthony. Yeah. It's a very good question, because I think the issue of balance has evolved for media. One of the articles that was recommended reading for this event, Catherine Weiner's article in The Guardian, talked about how you were in a situation now where for journalists, and not perhaps the ones that you would consider to be part of the true journalism, do no longer see it as their job necessarily to be identifying what is true or factual or not, but they see their job as reporting something. And so there was a very it's called the dead cat syndrome. Somebody throws a dead cat on a table and everybody focuses on the dead cat. They don't focus on investors' data or anything else that you're talking about. And there was an incident in the United Kingdom where there was an allegation made regarding the Prime Minister and his time at university and what he may or may not have done to a certain part of the anatomy of a pig. And this became a story that was covered everywhere and by everyone. And it wasn't true. And yet, what remains is that perception element. I had experience of the balance question when I was working briefly in London for the EU, and I found it a reasonably a far less difficult experience than I thought I would find it. When you were focusing mainly on the issues rather than on the EU. If you're talking about climate change and what the EU could contribute to it, you were on a far easier track than if you were focusing on the EU itself. And the balance issue was, I think, very connected, particularly with respect to the BBC, on the fact that the BBC, in order to finance itself, requires the approval of government for its funding, its license fee. And over the last decades, the pressure applied by the government to the BBC in order to secure its license fee did have some connection with the degree of coverage and airing that was given to the views of those who might not be considered to be on the pro-European side, on the sceptical European side, as far as the phobic side, but certainly on the sceptical side. And so what that meant was that, for example, I'd get invited to talk about climate change, and there would be someone who would be from an organization questioning the European Union rather than on the subject of climate change. And so I think that at times that seemed to be taken to a little bit of an extreme, and it's a difficult one. And I don't think that that's exclusive to the UK. One thing I wanted to do very briefly is just pick up on an idea that Brian chucked out in his article, which I recommend to everyone, and that is: should we not protect voters in the same way that we protect consumers, in terms of information provision and also the impunity, the fact that you can get away with not quite murder but almost. You have an advertising standards authority that will control advertising a product if you want to market this product, and you have a Trade Descriptions Act that will ensure that this is what it says. It is a bottle of water, it is still water, it has been produced here, etc. And shouldn't we extrapolate something of that into the voter domain?
I'm going to throw out an Australian example, which is a sort of proxy for that, with its ups and downs. But one thing that was introduced about 20 years ago in Australia, it was something called the Charter of Budget Honesty. And I think it was introduced with a political perspective in mind, but it didn't end up having that effect so much. And so it required that each political party that was on the ballot had to submit a full budget for independent audit before the election, to see whether the numbers added up, so that you couldn't go and make vague promises about what the effect of your tax cut or your new tax would be. Like, it had to be independently audited by somebody. Now, that comes with a bit of a fiscal perspective in mind, that it implies that you obviously care about a balanced budget if you'd have that there in the first place. But what it certainly did was remove the he said, she said aspect out of it. Like, there were just cold, hard, factual assessments by registered accountants that the political people couldn't argue with. I've entirely forgotten who was next. Rolf, was it your turn?
No.
No,
I think it's Isabel.
Okay, over here, Isabel. We'll give the last word to Emily as our host.
What, last word, this is it?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a bit close.
We're getting close to 12 o'clock, so this will be your last word. Yeah.
Okay. No, but just I think many things have been said already. I mean, now we have to be concrete. And to end up with, I mean, personally, and that's what we are doing in France, we are really convinced that there is a fight in front of us, and we want to defend the EU project, because there is very much to say, and very much good things to say, and this is what we will continue to do. Maybe just one thing on balance and fact. It's true that because we are currently preparing a fact-checking in France, and between fact-checking and argumentation, there is a gray zone. And this gray zone is difficult because, there are facts which are easy. Let's say, for example, Marine Le Pen said that Erasmus has nothing to say with the EU. So that's the EU is for nothing in Erasmus. So this is easy to deny. But on many other issues, it's true that there are also political considerations. So we have to find the right way between what is pure fact and what is explanation and argumentation about what we are doing. If I give another example, there is this idea that Schengen is facilitating the life of criminals. In a way, it's not wrong, because criminals are crossing border easily like everybody. But in another way, it's wrong, because there are many other aspects like the SIS and that EU has promoted in order to facilitate cross-border investigation, and it works. So this is not fact-checking. this is rather explanation and argumentation. And we have to do both. And so this is something where we have to find a right line and in explaining what the EU is doing. But yes, well, so just I will end with my first word that we will continue and we are ready for fighting the battle for the EU, at least in France.
Just close up one kind of practical thought, which relates to there's a problem in Britain, which I think you'll encounter in France and everywhere else, really, which is that it's accentuated in Britain, which is that the broadcast media, which, as you rightly say, are regulated and are required to report impartially, are very much influenced by, their agenda is influenced by the press. And the press, as I've said, is essentially 90% plus right-wing and anti-EU. So the way in which the broadcasters decide what a story is, for example, the story about Cameron and the pig, the way in which they decide what a story is and what they're going to cover is influenced by these extremely right-wing publications to a disproportionate degree. Now, how can you address it? One of the ways in which I think you can address it is take a leaf out of Alistair Campbell's book and practice very fast, very effective rebuttal. Exploit the termites, but do it not just the next day. Do it immediately. Be there when the paper comes out, as it were, and get on top of them straight away, in the middle of the night if need be. And it's still, it's still geared to the, because that way you will get to the Today programs, the morning radio programs, the drive time shows, which discuss these. If you get your rebuttal in forcefully straight away, this is simply not true. You have a better chance of redressing the balance.
Emily, do you have any last contribution?
Okay. Just in relation to balance, I think that anything, it's a bit like ethics. It can't be achieved just purely with a ruler or a calculator. And I think balance has to lead, proper balance has to lead to the fullest possible understanding of whatever's going on. But I think just in relation to somebody mentioned the issue of trust, and we discussed that briefly. And certainly that goes to the heart of what my work as European Ombudsman, and which is part of the reason why I decided to have the seminar here today. And I do a lot of work, as you know, on transparency, and one of the pieces that we are increasingly working on is transparency of the Council. And the Council tends to be the least transparent of the institutions and possibly the most important. And for as long as there's a lack of transparency, it allows member state governments to hide their role in making decisions here in Brussels, which affect the lives of the people that they represent. And as long as there are barriers put up to that, a vacuum of proper information and balanced information will be there, and that vacuum will be filled by populists and others with their lies, distortions, exaggerations or whatever. But also, just to hark back to something that Ryan said and his particular personal response when he was spokesperson to an issue that had come up when he sympathised with people who had lost their jobs. I was just wondering, had Ryan been there when he was asked the question about former Commission President Barroso's appointment to Goldman Sachs, what his immediately emotionally intelligent human response might have been. Because I sat back for a while and observed what the spokespersons were doing, and they didn't say what possibly Ryan might have said. You can correct me if I'm wrong, which is, yes, at the very least it doesn't look good. Instead, they insisted on saying that no rules were broken and so on, despite this very, very strong emotional and intellectual response as well from so many people that there was something fundamentally wrong about this. And I think Le Monde put it very well. If you don't sort out that problem, talking about the institutions and the Commission in particular, then the populace will sort it out for you. So none of that is rocket science. The youngest person in this room could understand that was it. So it's something that the institutions have to cop onto. I think people expect more than anything honesty. And I think that honesty in relation to the institutions, and particularly now in relation to the Council, comes through transparency, and be as fully transparent over what they actually do and tell their people honestly about it.
Okay. Thank you very much. We've just run 3 or 4 minutes over time, but I know that things like those live streams are expensive and that you also all have the rest of your day to get on with. So I apologize for the questions that we didn't get to. One hopeful note that I would like to end on is that I've been following the Twitter discussion. And so rather than do one of those things where you artificially summarize everything that went on in the discussion, I want to point you to the Twitter feed for all of you who've been crowdsourcing the main points, because I think that those tweets really do cover the main points. So if you check out Disrupting EU on Twitter, I think you'll get a very good record of what was being discussed and raised here. So thank you to the Ombudsman for organizing and hosting the event. Thank you to each of our panelists. I certainly enjoyed it and made a large number of notes that I will try and follow up on. And thank you to all of you for your questions. Have a good day.